It was just after midnight when Ambulance 7's radio crackled to life. David, a seasoned paramedic and ambulance driver for nearly a decade, was ready for his usual quiet shift. The soft hum of the engine as he navigated the empty roads of rural England was oddly soothing, offering the stillness that had come to define his night duties. David had always found solace in the nighttime hours, when the world seemed to quiet down, and only the hum of the ambulance and the occasional radio call interrupted the solitude. But tonight was different. The dispatcher's voice, distorted by static, interrupted his thoughts. "Ambulance 7, we have a report of a death at 56 Elm Ridge Road. Please respond immediately." David quickly adjusted the radio, his grip tightening on the wheel as he turned the vehicle toward the location. He had driven this route hundreds of times before. Elm Ridge was a small, forgotten street on the outskirts of town. A place where the fog seemed to settle permanently and where few people dared to go after dark. He knew that house. It had a reputation. Despite the house being unremarkable in appearance, 2 stories, ivy creeping up the stone walls, with a single porch light flickering weakly, it had been the subject of rumors for years. Stories passed down by previous ambulance drivers, paramedics, and even local police officers. Whispers of strange occurrences, eerie sounds, and the occasional sighting of a figure standing in the window at night. But David had never paid much attention to those stories. They were just stories after all. As he drove down the darkened road, his headlights cut through the thick fog, casting long shadows on the trees lining the path. The road felt unnaturally silent. He glanced over at his partner, Sarah, a young and enthusiastic paramedic who had only been on the job for a year. Sarah was staring out the window, her face drawn with concern. "Everything all right?" David asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her tone hesitant. "It just feels off tonight, doesn't it?" David didn't respond, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right either. The air seemed too still, too heavy, as though something was waiting in the darkness, watching. When they arrived at the house, they saw the porch light flickering as usual. David parked the ambulance on the gravel driveway, and the two of them stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant sound of an owl hooting from the forest behind the house. The door to the house was already ajar, a sign that someone inside was expecting them. David knocked lightly before stepping in, the door creaking eerily as it swung open. Inside, the house was dark, with only a few candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. It was uncomfortably cold, and the smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. They were greeted by an older woman, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's my husband, Samuel. He passed away in his sleep." David nodded sympathetically and gestured for Sarah to follow him. As they made their way up the staircase to the bedroom, the hairs on the back of David's neck stood up. The feeling of being watched intensified. In the dimly lit room, Samuel Greaves lay peacefully in his bed. His appearance was almost serene, his body cold to the touch. The quietness of the room felt oppressive, as though the air itself was thick with some unseen presence. David, ever the professional, began preparing the body for transport, while Sarah quietly moved around the room, gathering the necessary paperwork and taking notes. As David placed the body on the stretcher, he suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, expecting to see Sarah, but she was across the room, focused on her task. David took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. It was just the old house, the creaks and groans of its aging frame. But then, just as he bent down to adjust the body on the stretcher, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, an indistinct shadow moving quickly across the room, as though something had darted past the door. His heart skipped a beat. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room. There was nothing there. "Sarah," David called out, his voice slightly trembling, "did you see that?" Sarah looked up from her notes, confused. "See what?" David didn't answer immediately, trying to shake off the sensation that something was terribly wrong. He returned to his task, finishing the preparations for transport and placing the body in the ambulance. Sarah followed him out, and the house seemed to exhale as the door creaked closed behind them. The long, lonely road. The trip back was uneventful at first, the quiet stillness of the countryside offering nothing but the sound of the engine and the occasional hum of the radio. But the further they drove, the more the unease began to grow. It was as though the very air in the ambulance had changed, becoming thick with tension. David glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, in the back of the ambulance. He shook his head, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling persisted. As they neared the outskirts of town, something strange began to happen. The lights on the dashboard began to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. The headlights flickered in and out of focus, making it difficult to see the road clearly. "David," Sarah's voice broke through the silence. "Look at the road." David followed her gaze and his stomach dropped. The road ahead seemed to shimmer, like a heat wave rising from the pavement. But this was different. It wasn't heat. It was as though the road itself was distorting, twisting, becoming something unnatural. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, a tall, thin silhouette standing in the middle of the road. David slammed on the brakes, the ambulance screeching to a halt just inches away from the figure. But when the headlights illuminated the area, there was no one there. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. David nodded slowly, his heart racing. "I don't know what I saw, but there was something there." Before Sarah could respond, the ambulance lurched forward, the front tires skidding on the wet road. David fought to regain control of the wheel, but the road was slick, and the vehicle was moving faster than he could manage. The world outside seemed to spin as David tried desperately to steer the ambulance back on track. But it was too late. The vehicle careened off the road, crashing through the guardrail and plummeting down a small embankment. The darkness that followed. David awoke with a sharp pain in his head. He groaned, slowly opening his eyes. The air smelled of smoke and burned rubber, and the sound of distant sirens could be heard faintly. "Sarah?" David called out weakly, his voice hoarse. He heard a soft groan from the passenger seat. Sarah was unconscious but still breathing. David quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and reached over to check on her. She stirred and opened her eyes, looking dazed. "David? What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We crashed," David replied, trying to remain calm. "We need to get out of here." The ambulance had rolled down the embankment, but they were lucky. It could have been much worse. The front of the vehicle was crumpled, but the rear compartment, where the body had been placed, was intact. David could hear the faint hum of the sirens getting closer. As they stumbled out of the ambulance and made their way to the roadside, David looked back at the vehicle. He felt the same sense of unease wash over him. The darkness seemed to reach out from the trees, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if something was watching them. And then, through the trees, he saw it. A shadowy figure standing silently, watching them from a distance. It was the same figure he had seen on the road. The shadows in the woods. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stood, staring at the dark silhouette standing just beyond the trees. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and an indistinct face that seemed to flicker in and out of view, as though it was caught between worlds. He blinked, his mind racing, but the figure remained. No words came to his lips. His legs felt as though they were frozen in place. The fog, which had thickened even further since the crash, swirled around the figure, almost as if it was pulling the shadow toward them. His instincts screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. "David, what is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible in the eerie silence that had fallen around them. She was standing beside him now, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Stay close." Slowly, almost as if guided by some unseen force, the figure took a step forward. David's heart raced as the figure moved, its silhouette growing larger, more solid with each passing second. He could see no face, only a void, a dark emptiness that filled the space where one should have been. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him as if the very atmosphere was shifting. "Sarah," David said, his voice firm now, though his insides twisted with fear. "We need to get back to the ambulance. Now." But as he turned to move, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, the trees swaying unnaturally. The figure advanced again, and David heard something that chilled him to the bone. A faint whispering, like voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. It was coming from the figure, or perhaps from the woods themselves. "Don't look back," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. She had begun to walk quickly, her steps uneven as though she were being pulled by some invisible force. David couldn't help but follow her, though every instinct told him to turn and confront whatever was watching them from the shadows. They reached the wrecked ambulance, but something had changed. The once familiar vehicle now felt alien, as though it too had become part of the eerie atmosphere. The doors were ajar, and the back of the ambulance, where the body had been placed, was open. The stretcher, empty. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Where is Samuel?" There was no answer. The ambulance was silent. Only the whispering in the distance grew louder, more pronounced, like an insistent hum reverberating through the air. And then it hit him. Samuel's body had disappeared. "David, we need to get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice trembling with panic. "I don't think we're alone anymore." David's mind raced. They were not alone. The shadowy figure, the whispers, and now the body was gone. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and though every part of him screamed to run, he knew that something far worse than a simple crash had just occurred. "We can't leave. We have to find out what happened," David said, more to himself than to Sarah. He had to understand. He had to know what force was toying with them. The thing in the fog. They ventured back toward the woods, cautiously, as the fog seemed to grow thicker around them, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The trees, once just shadows in the night, now seemed alive, their gnarled branches twisting and groaning as though they were stretching toward them. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them from all sides. It was as though the very air itself was alive, pressing in on them, pushing them deeper into the forest. With every step, David felt the sense of dread intensify. The figure was gone, but something else had taken its place, a feeling of being hunted. He could feel eyes on them, something unseen but very real, following their every movement. The sensation was almost suffocating. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from behind them, deep and guttural. Sarah gasped and spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the oppressive fog and the twisting trees. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, clutching his arm. David nodded, his heart racing. "Stay close." They continued through the woods, moving quickly, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The further they went, the darker and more foreboding the forest became. The air seemed to freeze around them, and the fog, now thick and suffocating, curled around their legs like tendrils, making it harder to move forward. And then they saw it. A small clearing in the forest, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. At the center of the clearing stood the same figure from earlier, only now it was not alone. Surrounding it were shadows, countless shadows, rising from the ground like smoke, swirling around the figure in an ever-tightening spiral. David couldn't move. He could only watch as the shadows seemed to coalesce into something otherworldly. The air grew colder, and the whispering intensified, now a cacophony of voices that seemed to be calling to him, urging him to approach. Don't go any closer," Sarah whispered, clutching David's arm with white-knuckled hands. But it was too late. Without thinking, David stepped forward, drawn toward the figure in the clearing. It was as if something was pulling him, something far stronger than his will. He heard Sarah calling to him, but her voice was distant, fading into the background of the ever-louder whispers. As David stepped closer, the figure turned toward him. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a void, an empty hole that seemed to suck in the light around it. The closer he got, the more the shadows seemed to swirl around him, becoming thicker, more oppressive. "David, stop," Sarah cried, but her voice was drowned out by the rising storm of whispers. The figure raised its arm, and the air seemed to tremble in response. The ground beneath David's feet shifted, and he stumbled, falling to his knees. The world around him spun, the fog closing in on him, and he felt as though he were being suffocated by the very atmosphere. And then he saw it. In the distance, just beyond the clearing, there was a shadow, a familiar shape. The body of Samuel Greaves, standing upright, but impossibly so, as though he had been reanimated. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and gaunt, and he was staring directly at David with an expression of pure malice. "No. No, this can't be real," David whispered, his voice trembling. Samuel's lips curled into a grotesque smile, and then he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Samuel's voice was not his own. It was a low, guttural growl, as if something was speaking through him. "You're part of the game now. And there's no escape." The shadows around them began to move, creeping closer, reaching toward David and Sarah. And in that moment, David understood. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just a bad shift gone wrong. They were part of something far darker, something ancient, and they would never leave these woods alive. The end of the road. David didn't remember how he and Sarah managed to escape the clearing. All he remembered was the overwhelming sense of dread, the whispers, the shadows, and the figure in the center of it all. When he finally came to his senses, they were back at the wrecked ambulance, the fog lifting and the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The forest was silent. David looked around, but the figure, the shadows, and the body of Samuel Greaves were gone. It was as though they had never existed at all. Sarah was still by his side, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the weight of the experience hanging heavy between them. Eventually David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "We leave," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "We get out of here, and we never come back." And with that, they climbed into the ambulance, drove back to the station, and never spoke of what happened that night again. The case was closed, and Samuel Greaves was never found again, his body, if it had ever truly existed, disappearing as mysteriously as it had come. But both David and Sarah knew the truth. They had encountered something that night, something not of this world, something that had played with them, toyed with them, and left them with the unsettling knowledge that some places, some roads should never be traveled. The haunting returns. Time passed, and although David and Sarah tried to forget that night, the shadows of what had happened never truly disappeared. They returned to their duties, continuing with their routines, but there was always something wrong. David couldn't sleep properly, and every time he glanced at the rearview mirror in the ambulance, he felt like something was watching him. Sarah felt the same, though neither of them ever spoke about the fear they shared. But everything changed on one unexpected night. David was working that night alone. Sarah was on leave. He felt uneasy but tried to calm himself. When the radio crackled, it was the dispatcher, reminding him of an emergency call on the very same road, Elm Ridge Road. The road he could never forget. He sighed heavily, started the ambulance, and drove down the dark, winding path. As he passed the house where he and Sarah had once picked up Samuel Greaves' body, he noticed something different. The lights in the house were flickering just like before. But this time, something even stranger happened. In the window of the house, there was a shadow, a tall figure, standing and staring out from behind partially drawn curtains. Although he felt reluctant, David decided to stop the ambulance and get out to check. No one greeted him at the door. However, when he entered the house, he immediately sensed that the atmosphere was wrong, cold, silent, full of tension. All the fear he had buried came rushing back. David opened the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, and entered only to find the room empty. There was no body. No family to confirm what had happened. Just an eerily quiet space. But then he heard it. A faint whispering sound from the corner of the room. Like someone calling his name. "David?" He quickly turned around, and this time the figure wasn't blurry or indistinct. It was very clear. Samuel Greaves, his face mutilated and wrapped in a shroud, stood right in front of the door. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and decayed, and he was staring directly at David with a look of pure malice. "No, no, this can't be real," David whispered, his voice trembling. Samuel's lips curled into a grotesque smile, and then he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Samuel's voice wasn't his own. It was low and guttural, as though something else was speaking through him. "You're part of the game now. And there's no escape." The shadows surrounding them began to shift, crawling toward David, tightening around him like chains, pulling him into the inky void that surrounded them. David tried to scream, to fight, but the more he struggled, the more the shadows seemed to devour him. His body grew weak, and his vision blurred as the darkness consumed him. But just as he thought he would lose consciousness, the shadows vanished. David awoke. He felt like he was lying in a hospital bed, his body weak and restrained. Sarah was beside him, her face tense, her eyes red and swollen as if she had been crying. "Sarah, what happened?" David asked hoarsely. "David, you almost died tonight," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But something strange happened. When we found you, you seemed to be asleep. There's something wrong with that place." David could only stare blankly at the window, still hearing the faint echoes of those whispers in his head. The fear that had settled deep in his bones seemed to rise again, creeping through his veins. The events of the previous night, if it was even truly a night, felt like a nightmare, but the lingering terror suggested it was far more than just a bad dream. Sarah squeezed his hand tightly, snapping him out of his thoughts. "David, we need to get out of here. This isn't over." "It's not over, and I think it's still watching us." David looked at her, his mind racing. He wanted to believe it was all in their heads, that it was some kind of collective trauma that had caused them both to hallucinate. But deep down he knew better. Whatever it was, whatever force had taken hold of them that night, it wasn't done. It wasn't finished with them. The final encounter. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and dread. David tried to return to normal, but every shadow seemed to watch him, every creak in the floorboards made his heart skip. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. One evening, about a week after the incident, David was alone again. Sarah was off duty, and he had been assigned to a quiet shift, driving the ambulance through the small streets of the town. The fog had rolled in again, heavier this time, shrouding everything in an eerie stillness. David's headlights cut through the mist as he drove, the road eerily empty. But as he passed Elm Ridge, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The house, the same house, loomed in the distance, its lights flickering once again. He couldn't ignore it. He had to go back. He turned onto the familiar, winding road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every passing second. As he neared the house, he saw that the door was wide open. A strange, unsettling feeling washed over him, but he forced himself to stop. His pulse quickened as he got out of the ambulance and approached the house, his every step heavy and reluctant. As he entered, everything seemed just as he had left it. The same eerie silence, the same dark shadows, as though time had stood still in this place. He moved cautiously through the house, and when he reached the bedroom, he froze. There, lying in the middle of the floor, was the body of Samuel Greaves. But this time it was different. The body was decayed, twisted, as if the figure had been here far longer than it should have been. His mouth was open in a silent scream, but his eyes, those hollow black eyes, were still fixed on David. A voice echoed from behind him, but not from Samuel. It was deeper, darker. It wasn't human. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered. "You will never leave." David spun around, but no one was there. Only the shadows, thick and pulsating, filled the room. He could feel them pressing against him, suffocating him. The air became thick with a sense of inevitability, as if the very walls were closing in. He turned and bolted toward the door, but the hallway seemed to stretch infinitely. The door to the outside was no longer there. Instead, a swirling vortex of darkness surrounded him, pulling him deeper into the house. The house that had now become a trap, a prison. Suddenly he felt a cold hand on his shoulder and he froze. He turned slowly to find Sarah standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. But there was something off about her, something wrong. Her lips parted to speak, but the voice that came from her was not hers. "We are here to stay," it said in that same dark, guttural voice. David screamed in horror as the world around him began to dissolve into blackness, his mind succumbing to the overwhelming force of whatever had taken hold of them. The final moment. The next morning, a search party was sent to Elm Ridge. It had been a routine check. David and Sarah had failed to report for duty, and their families were frantic with worry. The area around Elm Ridge was searched thoroughly, but no trace of either David or Sarah was found. The house, too, was empty. The ambulance was found, parked on the side of the road, with no one inside. Inside the cab, however, a lone item lay on the seat, David's badge still warm to the touch. And on the dashboard, written in what appeared to be smoke or soot, was a single word: stay. As we reach the end of this tale, we are left with one haunting question. What happens when we encounter something we can't explain? Something that exists beyond our understanding, something that seems to have its own agenda, its own dark will. David and Sarah's story is a warning, a reminder that some places are best left untouched, and some roads should never be traveled. There are forces in this world, ancient, unseen, that can take hold of us, twist our perception, and pull us into realms we are not meant to enter. If you've ever felt the weight of something watching you, the chills running down your spine at night, remember, not all shadows are harmless and some whispers are not meant to be ignored. There are things lurking in the dark, and sometimes, it's better not to ask questions. Stay safe, stay alert, and above all, stay away from the places that feel wrong. Because once you step into their world, it might be too late to turn back.